Microphone, and then everybody can have a microphone. Thank you so much for those opening remarks. I actually have a bunch of questions that I want to ask, but I think before doing that, I saw a lot of heads nodding. And are there things that you wanted to pick up on that others have said when they? Yeah, exactly. Who wants to jump in? Who wants to jump in first? Were there things that you heard that themes we should spend a little bit more time on? Yeah, vas-y, Denise.
There's one thing I think we haven't mentioned that in fact is like the elephant in the room, is how climate change will affect all what we do. And I don't think that any discipline nowadays that is taught, no matter where, any classroom should not talk about climate change and the impact it will have on the environment. I know that in the college, we do that now even in culinary arts. We do it in the nursing classes. We do it in the engineering classroom, in the construction, because sustainability is like un intangible. C'est quelque chose qu'on peut pas ne pas parler. And that we need to preoccupy ourselves with, comme on n'a pas le choix, là. We owe it to the generations to come. And I don't think we mention it, but I think it's key. And we cannot teach like we were teaching 5 years ago even. Certainly not 10 years ago, but because, and this is directly linked to ISSP, in fact, when we think about sustainability.
Kimberly, jump in.
So that comment and sort of what you said about those real world problems makes me think a lot about how we can foster better collaboration sort of cross-sectorally, because so I just finished up a big study looking at how members of parliament use information, and a lot of them said to me, like, oh, I just wish that I could find, scientists who are working on this problem because I just need evidence to help me make these decisions. And I thought, like, well, why aren't you putting those questions out there to universities? So, linking up government issues, things like climate change, doing more collaborations between universities and real world problems, like bringing those end users to universities and making our university programs thinking about those real world problems that we're trying to solve. And I know, I'm seeing a lot of government departments, having worked in government policy, I'm seeing places like, National Defense is now putting out challenges to the university space saying, hey, like, we have these problems we need to solve, go at it. Like, what do you think we should do? And I'm really happy to see those things happening, because I know sort of from working in a university space myself, there wasn't a lot of impetus for me to collaborate with other sectors. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to the questions that the government might want to solve with my science, or that other sectors might want to solve. So I think that there's a real need for building better bridges between the end users of research and science, and bringing in even like the ideas of undergraduates, because like you were saying, students have really great ideas. So I think that there's a lot of space for improvement there.
Yeah, Jason.
One quick thought related to, and again, I'm here to be provocative at the minute, but imagine for a minute we take our research councils, and rather than give the money directly to universities, you give it to the stakeholders that then the universities have to engage with to get it. That's a very provocative version of rethinking grants, but there are ways to build in co-production. There's ways to insist on co-production with stakeholders as part of that process. But another thing that Denise mentioned just briefly, she used the word accreditation. And one of the things, it's rare for me to talk to an educational innovator in most Western countries who doesn't use a swear word before the word accreditation or accreditors, because all too often it's the accreditation process that often becomes a real challenging. It's easier to count lecture hours than it is to count outcomes coming out of degrees. And to your point, Denise, about evaluating the skills and knowledge that individuals have and help them make that connection, that does put more onus and work than simply counting how many lecture hours have you done, and I really think we need to reevaluate how we're doing accreditation. and it all goes into that pipeline of what's the incentive structure. What are people being rewarded as faculty members to do or not do? What's going to lead to promotion? Is it just going to be papers, or is it going to be educational innovation? Is it going to be stakeholder engagement? And I would argue that in the end, the knowledge that's actually generated from those processes turns out to be way more valuable. It's not just cited once or twice by another academic. It's actually used in real-world environments to solve real-world problems.
Yeah, but I mean, there are real-world consequences of that in terms of what activities get crowded out, right? That are currently in the existing incentive structures.
Loyalist College was telling me the other day, Loyalist College is in Belleville in Ontario. They were telling me that for their 70 programs that they offer, they can do prior learning assessment recognition. And what they are able to say now is that whoever do the process of prior learning assessment recognition will graduate. This is just amazing. When you think about it, if the person does the process of prior learning assessment recognition, they will graduate because it means they will complete whatever they wanted to do. That's a good incentive. And, you know, people are looking for students. The best way to have students is, in fact, to do prior learning assessment. And people naively think, no, it means they will stay not as long in my institutions. It's the opposite.
Leah, what would you like to add to
the whole list here, but yes to all of the above. Again, I think I should have even actually taken a step. I'm going to just add a big business perspective piece here and talk about when we set up workforce strategies. Now, numbers did change last week, but we have record number of job shortages in this country right now. And, well, on one level, record low unemployment, but, you know, jobs without people, people without jobs, and the whole skills mismatch thing. And on one level, I will, you know, and I have started to call business out on this because I think we have to better articulate our needs. But that has to be a discussion as well. And again, you know, academia can be academia for the sake of academia. I'm not going to challenge that on one level, but we have to start. It's this co-production and all of this. You know, that faculty as broker is a really interesting idea to me. And again, across, I mean, I've got all little, we could talk about AI and cybersecurity and the need to react, because I'll tell you, if you don't, we are already as the business community. You know, I do a lot of work in the AI and cybersecurity space, both for specialized, but looking at a general workforce piece. But, you know, I've watched in 3 years from it, you know, and in Quebec, it's infamous, right? 7 years to qualify for a degree. Well, you know what the big corps will do? They'll take them and train them themselves, right? And they're done, right? And so I've seen the lag. Honestly, if I get another request this year or information session about an MBA in AI specialization, no, like it's you know, but that's about 4 years too late, right? You've got to be nimble, shorter programs. We can talk about, you know, the whole immigrant piece. So I have a lot to say, but I think the thing is that everyone has to get in the game or we'll all lose. And competitiveness-wise, okay, we are, you know, again, you know, Canada does quite well, but, you know, it's the 2017 Global Talent Index. That, I mean, there's lots of measures we can use, but they rank up more than 100 countries to their ability to develop skills, needs, and to prosper. Canada's 17, right, from 2017. But you know what? We fell. We've been dropping well, not dramatically, but overall more dramatic. And, you know, the usual suspects are ahead of us. I would argue, you know, the Scandinavians, US, UK, Singapore. But guess who's ahead of us now? Countries like New Zealand, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. Yeah. So, you know, we can't take this for, it's the whole competitiveness piece, absolutely.
So here's a question that was on my mind as we were having our, listening to your opening remarks. So, you know, I think, you know, yay us, we did a good job of having a panel that brings a variety of different perspectives, but we don't have a policy maker on this table. So I wanted to ask you a question around, role of government here. What are the gaps? How is Canada doing? Jason looks like he's about to jump over here and grab the mic out of my hand. So go, Jason, and we can just move this way across the table.
Here's the question that I would ask to that. What government department is technically responsible for higher education? We have government departments that look after education for K to 12, but in most Western countries, higher education is handled by a place like ISSP. It's handled by industry. It's handled in the UK, it's BEIS, Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy. But most of the focus in that environment is actually around the industrial landscape. It's around how do we produce. And yes, there is a connection to higher education, but most of it flows through where's the science funding? How much are we giving towards R&D? Look at the OECD index. The more you spend on R&D, the more productive we are. Clearly, that's causal enough. That's all we have to do. We require someone to have a 4-year education degree to teach kindergarteners, but a professor, to become a professor, doesn't necessarily have to have ever done an educational course in her or his career. Now, that's changed, that's evolving, and now you do have to do some amount of training and teaching, but it's nothing like what we require. Now, does that mean that the answer is we should put every professor through a 4-year degree? No, that is not what I am arguing. But it does speak, in my mind, to the holistic lack of policy thinking about what is the role of higher education and lifelong learning, aside from being higher research institutions that are generating knowledge, which there is a place for that, for sure, but there was a place for that when that was 1% of the population going through higher education. Scaling that model simply up to 50% going through higher education, it's not clear we need that much more higher research. We do need to think very carefully about that, and I don't know who's doing that. I don't know what government department to go to that we would invite someone to sit here at this panel on.
Good question.
Very good, Jason. In fact, I can tell you that there's no federal ministry. Canada is the only country that has no national ministry of education. The only other one is Antarctica. And Antarctica is not a country, it's a continent, and there's only penguins there. No, I'm serious. There are no others in the world. Even though when they have a federal systems like ours, and as you know, health is of provincial and territorial jurisdiction. Health. But guess what? We do have a federal ministry responsible for health, but we do not have a federal ministry of education. And this is a big, big problem for this country. I was talking about the hundreds of articulations agreements earlier that each college needs to have for each of their program. And that's not each of their schools, but each of their program. So why then in Europe, where there are multi-languages that are spoken, they have been able to have what we call, and they are different countries, the Bologna process and Erasmus. Us, we have 2 languages. And we're not able to do it, and it's one country. So that's my second dream. My first dream was PLAR, no matter who you are when you start, but my second is a national recognition system. And this would help both international students, it would help immigrants, and it would help Canadian students, not to start over, and at the same time, it would help employers. And the biggest barriers for that are the provinces and the accreditation bodies. Try to convince. So I'm beginning to think that we should, I asked some people, I was at UNESCO last week in Bonn, and I asked some people the question, so tell me more about Erasmus, how did it start? And I didn't know, but now I think I have some hope. Apparently when it started, member states were laughing about it. They were saying, this will never work, are you crazy? The European Union was laughing about it. They were saying, are you crazy? And they started just with the groups of the willing. So what I'm willing to do now is to work with those that are willing to do something like that in Canada. Why not? And the worst that can happen, it won't work. But it won't be worse than what is happening right now. And maybe we could start by one sector, and then we could add another sector. So I'm hoping. So if any of you are in the Wellings, please come to see me. I'm serious, by the way. I'm
Did you have
really
an
serious
example?
about
Yeah.
that.
I do, but go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to build off government policy perspective from like a little bit of a different example. And I'm actually glad I didn't give my examples because yours are much more interesting than mine. And I'm sure you in the audience are much more familiar than I am with the European apprenticeship model when we talk about industry. And you know, you talk about it writ large, but we've been digging into it just a little bit more to understand nuances but when you talk about a role of government and policy, it's the different ways they're financed in Europe, right? I mean, there's the beauty of it in and of itself, so we'll leave that or we can come back to it, right? But in the UK, where they levy the business tax, in France, where there's the threshold of businesses and if you don't hit it, then you pay. Germany through collective agreements. And I'll tell you, that's not business offering that up at the table, right? This is a very important role. Like government does have that important role as we think of, you know, even if it's work integrated learning or now the Canada tax benefit, that'll have the impact on the skilling and upskilling. This is where the government, it's central, absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess just sort of building a little bit on what you guys have spoken about. So my experience is less, I guess my comment is less about directly sort of the government's role in making sure that our students or our academics are supported, but more on sort of making sure that there's a better connection between academia and government. So I guess speaking to a little bit of what we do at Evidence for Democracy, so we do work with governments a lot on making sure that there is support for science. We did a lot of advocacy surrounding making sure that the capacity for science was increased. We were formed in the Harper government days and then have subsequently worked a lot with the government and making sure that, you know, our government is putting forward support for science and scientific integrity and things like that. But a lot of what we do is also education for scientists and ensuring that, you know, academics are involved in the conversations at the government table. So we do a lot of training for scientists on things like, you know, how does policy actually work? So, I mean, working now in academia and then moving into a policy role and then now working in my job now, I've seen, you know, the way that policy works. And I worked as a policy analyst, but most people who are sitting at the table, and they shouldn't necessarily be scientists, but most policy analysts and policy makers are not scientists. They don't have this perspectives of science. They're not necessarily thinking like scientists, and they may not be making decisions, you know, the way that scientists or folks working in higher education might need them to. And so, I mean, we're helping to do that from an E4D perspective in helping the academic sector learn how to communicate science for a policy audience, or, you know, even just learning about how the policy making cycle works. When do you talk to policymakers? Who are the people you should be talking to, and how does that work? Or how to communicate your science in a way that's more effective for policymakers. And it's interesting because we have tons and tons of students who are interested in knowing how to do that. You know, even if they're not interested in bridging into policy themselves, but are interested in actually, you know, making sure that their science is used in decision making, making sure that they have those connections to policymakers. There's a huge appetite for that. And I think, too, with this changing culture of misinformation, there's this ongoing discussion about what is the role of scientists in making sure that they have a voice in those conversations. You know, what is the social contract that exists between academics and the public and governments? And I think that there's a real we're at a real point where there's a responsibility of academics or folks in the higher education sector to be involving themselves in those conversations. So, I mean, the fact that the Science Policy Fellowship exists, that the government is actually bringing scientists in to work in those policy spaces and contribute to those conversations is really good. Same with things like the Recruitment of Policy Leaders program and other programs that are emerging and exciting. But I do think that there's a lot of gaps that exist in actually bridging those conversations between scientists and policymakers. So it's less about, I guess my comment is less about, you know, how is our government supporting that training, but how do we bridge those two worlds? And we do a lot of that work, but I think that there's a lot of need for that.
Great. Thank you so much. So I look out in this room and I see people here from the public sector, from the